Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We have finished the second book of Kings, and now we are going over the Gemara in Sanhedrin about many of the kings that we learned about in this book. For those people who've been following our series live and during the week, next week probably will be the last in the series. We have finished all the books from Yeshua, Shoftim, Shmuel Aleph, Shmuel Bet, Malachim Aleph, Malachim Bet. And now we're just revealing what the sages had to say about many of these kings. I'll just say again that this class is dedicated to Moshe ben David on the yahrzeit of his passing away. And our learning should be a merit to his soul and an aliyah to neshama. So for those who would like to follow or follow later, we're on 102a in Sanhedrin. And we are picking up. Last week we began and we were learning about Yeruvam. And now we pick up in the middle of what the sages had to say about Yeruvam. Then we'll go on to Achav and then to Menashe. Now, before we start, I want to say that we didn't run into this so much last week, but we will run into it throughout the learning today. And that is when you read the simple text of the second book of Malachim, you have these three kings, and you have other kings also, that are described over and over again as having doing evil in the eyes of God. Over and over and over again. And in virtually every case, there is no redeeming properties given to them. The Gemara has a completely different story. Not that what they did was evil in God's eyes, but what we're going to see, starting from the first story, is, and it's apparent that the sages had an unbroken tradition that what they're saying is true. Then they go into the text and they darshan, they expound on the text that fits into the tradition. And the tradition is that despite these three kings that we'll be learning about who did evil in God's eyes, and two of them, all of their lineage was wiped out because of the tremendous evil that they did, mostly idol worship. And yet, here we see that all three of them were considered great Torah scholars, which in a certain way makes what they did even worse, because it wasn't that they didn't know what they were doing. Apparently they did know what they were doing, but again, it's not like the sages saw in the text in a simple way what they're about to explain. So ArtScroll also says the same thing, is that it must be that they had a tradition about these kings, and then they were able to look into the text and see how this could be true. So again, we're starting on 102a with, it says that Yeruvam departed from Yerushalayim. We learned that Yeruvam had a disagreement with Shlomo HaMelech, and he left the city. And then it says, V'yimtza Achia Shiloni, and then once God had determined that, and it's in the text, that Shlomo at the end of his reign, he also did what was called evil in the eyes of God. And we learned that it sounds like he worshipped idols. But it's explained, it's not like he worshipped idols, but he didn't stop his many, many wives from worshiping their idols and even setting them up. And he didn't stop them. And that was considered a tremendous fault, lacking. And God made it clear that a good part of the kingship was going to be taken away from his children. And here we get into the story of how the northern kingdom was established with 10 of the tribes, and only 2 of the tribes remained with the southern kingdom. So it says, God sent the prophet Achia Shiloni, and he found Yeruvam b'derech v'hu mitkaseh b'salma chadasha, and he was wearing a new garment, a new robe. Ushnehem levadam b'sadeh, and the 2 of them were in the field alone. And so in the text, it explains that is when Achia Shiloni said, I am coming with God's message that you will be given 10 tribes and you will become the king. But he warned them that your power and your legitimacy comes from your following the Torah and following God. And so the Gemara says, first of all, we should point out that the commentaries have differing opinions. Who was wearing the new robe? Was it Achia Shiloni or was it Yeruvam? Because what happens is that Achia Shiloni takes this robe and he rips it into 10 pieces and into 12 pieces, and he gives 10 of them to Yeruvam, indicating that you will become king over 10 of the tribes. But it's not clear who is wearing this new robe. Now, what's interesting, you have a parallel story in the book of Shmuel, that after Shaul does not fulfill God's command in the war against Amalek, and Shmuel comes to rebuke him and tell him that God is taking the kingship away from you. And so it says, and he went to leave, and he grabbed him by his cloak, and it tore. And Shmuel said, like, this is a sign from God that God is tearing away the kingship from you. And there, the sages also, the commentaries over the ages, who reached out and grabbed whose garment? Was it Shaul who reached out to Shmuel, kind of like, don't go, please stop? Or Shaul went to leave and Shmuel grabbed him and ripped the garment. So here you have a similar thing. But look what the Gemara says. So it says, what does it mean, a new robe? Why did they have to tell us that he was wearing a new robe? And so the Gemara says that this is to indicate that Yeruvam's Torah knowledge had no defect. It was like a new garment. In other words, when God chose Yeruvam, he was very righteous. He was a Torah scholar. And it continues. What's another understanding of a new robe? It says that Yeruvam and Achia exchanged chidushim, novel ideas about the Torah that had never been heard before. In other words, Yeruvam was on a very, very high level of Torah scholarship. And the new robe, again, they're reading into this because, again, they must have had a tradition that Yeruvam wasn't, in fact, a great Torah scholar. And so they, in a certain way, interpret the idea that he was wearing a new robe as Yeruvam's Torah knowledge had no defect, like a new robe, and that he was able to say chidushim in the Torah, new ideas in the Torah. And then the Gemara says, what does it mean they were in the field alone? So one opinion from Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav was that compared to them, all the other scholars of that generation were like grass in the field. They were all by themselves. They were on a level all alone in Torah scholarship compared to everyone else in the generation. Others say that Torah ideas were revealed to them like an open field. So here you see the text is, we never would have seen this in the text if the sages didn't say it. And since there's no textual proof for what they're saying, it must be that they had a tradition and they are giving over the tradition. Now we have to remember that the Torah, the oral Torah, well, today, in the age of computers, where everything is recorded, everything is at your fingertips, we have a very, very hard time understanding an oral tradition and their ability to hand it down from generation to generation. Okay, so the Gemara goes on, and here it sounds like a digression, but we'll see the connection to Yeruvam. So Rav Chanina bar Papa says, Kol haneneh min ha'olam hazeh belo bracha, ki'ilu gozel HaKadosh Baruch Hu v'knesset Yisrael, shene'emar gozel aviv v'imo v'yamar ein pesha chaver v'hu le'ish mashchit. So Rav Chanina bar Papa says, anyone who gets pleasure from this world without first reciting a blessing, it's as if he robs God as well as the people of Israel, because it's based on a verse that says, he who robs his father and mother and says it is no crime is a companion to a destructive person. So what does that mean? Who's the father and who's the mother? So the Gemara says, Ein aviv ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There is no ultimate father other than our Father in heaven. He's the father of all of us. And who is the mother? And they quote a verse that says that the mother is all of Am Yisrael, because it says in Proverbs, Shema b'ni musar avicha v'al titosh Torah imecha. Listen, my son, to the discipline or the rebuke of your father, and do not forsake the teachings of your mother. So it's understood that the father is the written Torah, and the mother is the oral Torah. And so, and then the verse says, so anyone who robs his father and mother and says it's no crime. In other words, anyone who makes a blessing and says, not a big deal. What's the big deal? So they say it's like they robbed their father and mother, and they are a friend to a destructive person. And so they ask, well, who is this destructive person? So they say, Chaver hu Yerovam ben Nevat shehishchit Yisrael avim b'shamayim. They're talking about Yerovam because he made all of Israel sin and destroyed the special bond between Israel and God by worshiping idols. And that we learned last week, how he set up these two golden calves and said, these are your gods, Israel, who took you out of Egypt. So all of that was just to explain that this destructive person, like the text says, that he did evil in God's eyes over and over and over again, it says it. And here, though, I guess the surprising thing is, it wasn't that he was ignorant. He was a Torah scholar, and yet because of pride and because of arrogance and because power went to his head, he turned to idol worship. Then another statement about Yerucham, and it says that Vayidach Yeruvam et Yisrael me'acharei Hashem v'hechtiam chata gedola. So it says that Yeruvam pushed Israel away from God and caused them to commit great sins. So Rav Chanin said, what can this be compared to? Like, it can be compared to two sticks that are knocked together, making one of them fly away. In other words, Yeruvam was the stick. He was the one, he was the king, he was the leader, he was respected. And it's as if he took his stick and he hit another stick, and another stick went flying. That stick that went flying was Israel being detached from their connection to God because of the sins that Yeruvam caused in all of Israel. So now the Gemara continues. Now remember, Yeruvam set up 2 golden calves and said, these are your gods who took you out of Israel. Out of Egypt. And so Reb Oshaya says, until the time of Yeruvam, Israel was sucking from 2 calves. Once Yeruvam came, they were now, from 1 calf. And from the time that Yeruvam came, they were now sucking from 3 calves. So the first calf is the golden calf. And that was a sin, as we're going to learn in a minute, that wasn't a sin that was done. The people did tshuva. And we could say it's over. That's it. That's it. But as we're about to learn, the effects, the repercussions of that sin, which caused the breaking of the first tablets, was something that went far into the future. And so here it says that until Yeruvam came, Israel was still feeling the repercussions of the golden calf. The Yeruvam is like 400 or 500 years after the golden calf. But by him setting up the 2 golden calves, now all of Israel, meaning especially the 10 tribes, were now in a certain way suckling from 3 calves. Then Rav Yitzchak says about the idea of the golden calf, and he says, Ein lecha kol puraniyot upuriyanut sheba la'olam she'ein ba echad me'esrim ve'arba behechra liter shel egel harishon. So he says that there's no punishment that comes into the world regarding Israel that doesn't contain 1/24 of the overbalance of a litra that wasn't connected to the golden calf. And it's explained that when let's say a grocer is measuring out, now we do it with computers, but in the old days they did it with scales And and the Torah tells us one of the mitzvahs in the Torah, you have to have proper weights. You can't tell someone, well, this weight is 1 kilo and it's really less than a kilo. And so they would have it that just to make sure, you'd add like 1/24th of a small measurement to make sure that you were giving a righteous measurement. So Rabbi Yitzchak says, basically, every punishment that Israel experiences, that there's always a little bit of the golden calf mixed into it. But Rav Chanina says he learns something different. He learns the same idea of 1/24, but he learns from a different verse that after 24 generations, this debt would be paid up. And so Rav Yitzchak was basically, he didn't put a time limit on it. It's like kind of like forever, there will always be a repercussion of that sin. What it's similar to is, to this day, all of humanity is still in a certain way feeling the results, the repercussions, the effects of the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So here they're saying a similar idea with the golden calf, that it was a kind of sin that just kind of stuck with Israel. And yet Rav Chanina learns that this is only true for 24 generations, and that was until the destruction of the temple. That after the destruction of the temple, this account, this is talking about the first temple, this account was paid off. So let's hope that that's true. Let's hope that Rav Chanina, his tradition is, with the destruction of the first temple, that we'll call it that the results and the repercussions of the golden calf have been paid off. Now the Gemara tells a story, and again, this is a clearly, one second. This is clearly an allegorical story, trying to make a point, like so many of the midrashim that we learn, so many of the Gemaras. So it says like this, that Hashem wanted to give Yeruvam a chance to do tshuva. Because it says that in the text, Achara devar hazeh lo shav Yeruvam midarko hara'ah. It says, and after this thing, Yeruvam did not turn away from his evil ways. So the question is, after what thing? So the Gemara tells a story in a certain way to give us an idea of what was this after. So it says like this, Ma'achar, what is this after that he didn't do tshuva? So it says, Achar she tifsu HaKadosh Baruch Hu et Yeruvam bebigdo, v'amar lo chazar b'cha. So it's as if God grabbed Yeruvam by his clothing and said, do tshuva. Do tshuva. But he continues and says, that, in other words, if you do tshuva, v'anivi ata uben yishai nitayel began Eden. I and you and the son of Yishai, meaning David, we will walk together in the Garden of Eden. So in other words, Hashem is giving him a chance to do tshuva. And so by grabbing him, it's a little bit forceful. But here it's like the carrot and the stick. He's saying, if you do tshuva, I will walk with you and with King David. What an honor, in the Garden of Eden. So how does Yeruvam respond? So he says, Mi barosh, who will be walking first? Meaning me or David HaMelech. And so God says, David, he will go first, and then you'll go. Yeruvam said, Ihachi lo be'ina. If that is true, I won't go. I'm not interested. And of course, he did not do tshuva. So again, this is an allegorical story trying to tell us that God gives him a chance to do tshuva. We'll see later, Manasseh did do tshuva. Here we see God gave him a chance to do tshuva. And because, again, of his pride and arrogance, and that's what we learned last week, the reason he set up these two golden calves is because if people would go to the temple in the southern kingdom, that would be a threat to his authority. It would be as if that's really the headquarters of spirituality, and that's where we meet with God. And therefore, the southern kingdom is really more important than the northern kingdom. And so because of that, he made it with a penalty of death. If someone from the northern kingdom is trying to go to the southern kingdom in order to keep the three pilgrimage holidays, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And so here, it's the same thing. God is offering him a chance to do tshuva and walk with him in the Garden of Eden with David HaMelech. And he says, well, who goes first? Again, you see his pride here. And that prevented him from doing tshuva. And that's what brought him from being a Torah scholar to setting up idols. Now, some of the commentaries, and again, this is even a deeper level here, is that when Yeruvam set up the golden calves, that it's possible that in his mind, in the mind of Israel, they weren't necessarily worshiping idols, but it had all of the appearances of worshiping idols. He set up his own Kohanim and Leviim, his own service in Beit El and in Dan. So he definitely did terrible things, and it smacked of idol worship. But if you remember the contract that he wrote with the elders, and even Achia Hashiloni signed, that even if Yeruvam would tell them to worship idols, they would listen to him, because no one, of course, expected him to do such a thing. And even when he did it, it was like, well, these aren't really idols. You can still worship God, but you have to do it in this way because that ensures my authority. So there's many, many, many different layers here. Many different layers here. One of the ideas, though, what does it mean that God grabbed him by his garment? And here the word is not a robe, but bigdo, beged. Beged is a garment. But the same root, bet, gimel, daled, also means someone who is a heretic, turns away from God. And so here there's a hint, first of all, when he was first made king of the northern kingdom, as we just learned, that Achiah took a new garment, a new robe, and cut it up in pieces and gave him 10 pieces as a symbolic affirmation that he would be king over 10 tribes. So here, God is hinting to him that, do you remember, I made you king over 10 tribes. At that point, you were righteous. Like, what happened to you? How did you? He grabbed him by his being a heretic and saying, do tshuva, return. It's not too late. And yet we see Yeruvam, from pride and arrogance and ego, could not stand the idea that David would go before him. So there's a lot to learn about this for our own lives. Okay, now we're going to learn two different stories that affirm the idea that these kings were great Torah scholars. So the first one is a story of Rabbi Abahu, and he used to, in his lectures, he used to talk about these three kings, and especially from the Mishnah, that these three kings have no portion in the world to come. And he would explain why that is and why the sages felt that they did not have a place in the world to come, even though we learned that there were many other kings who also were evil. But it doesn't say that their world to come was, as it were, taken away from them. But these three kings, because their children and their children's children followed in their ways, and for generations, the idol worship spread all over the northern kingdom. So he would speak about this in his lectures. One time he became sick, and he made a connection in his mind. Maybe it's because I'm saying terrible things about these three kings. So he decided, and apparently he told his students, that he's not going to speak about them in that way anymore. Then he became healthy again, and he started talking about them again. So his students said, didn't you undertake not to talk about these three kings the way you've been talking about them? And he answered, he said, did they do tshuva? Does that mean I have to do tshuva? In other words, they didn't do tshuva, so I can continue to speak about them. I thought I would stop, but they didn't do tshuva. So in a certain way, why should I? In a certain way. But again, the Mishnah says that they do not have a place in the world to come, obviously, because of the evil that they did. So it's not clear that he was talking lashon hara about them, because already the Mishnah says what their fate is. Now here's another story, though. Really an amazing story. It's of Rav Ashi. So he was giving a lecture, and at the end of the lecture, he talks about these three kings, and he says, tomorrow we're going to continue learning about this Mishnah, that these kings do not have a place in the world to come. And his language was that we're going to continue to talk about our colleagues. Meaning, again, the understanding that at least at one part of their lives, they were great Torah scholars. So he, in a story, gave them the benefit of the doubt. Yes, they did tremendous evil and they caused Israel to do evil, but there is some merit in the Torah that they learned. And so he called them our colleagues. So that night, Rav Ashi had a dream. And Menashe came to him in a dream and he said, "You called me a colleague of yours? Why did you call me a colleague? I'm really I'm really like your Rebbe." So Rav Ashi says, so Menashe says, he asks him a question. Menashe says, when you make a blessing on bread, what part of the bread should you cut to be your first piece? Menashe asks Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi says, I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know. I don't have a tradition. I never learned that. So he said to him, and you still call me a colleague of yours? So Rav Ashi says, okay, teach me. Where is the best place to cut the bread? And if you teach me, I will teach it in your name in my next lecture. So Menashe said to him, from the part of the bread that is baked the best and has a little crust, that's considered the finest place, the most tasty place. Not burnt, but just where there's a little bit of crust means it was cooked so thoroughly that it's the top of the line. So Rav Ashi said, now listen to this. This is one of the most amazing things. So Rav Ashi says to Menashe, it's all in a dream. He says to him, so if you are so learned, how did it come that you worshipped idols? What happened to you? How could that be? Listen what he says. So Menashe says to them, I havat hatam, havat nikitna b'shifule galima urahate avat rei. He says to him like this, and this is really important for our understanding of really a large part of Jewish history that we've been learning about. How did idol worship spread in Israel? How could it have been? So he says, Menashe says to Rav Ashi, he said, if you would have been there in my generation, you would have picked up your robe to be able to run faster to go serve idols. So the next day, Rav Ashi, he said to the rabbis, because they were colleagues. It's more than they were rabbis and students. And in many cases, that is the reality. But many times they were really colleagues, and each one would take a turn of teaching. So the next day, he said to the rabbis, we will begin our lecture today with our teachers. And now he promised Menashe in his dream that he would quote him, but here he changed the language from colleague to teacher. But the important thing here is the amazing statement that if you would have been in that generation, you would have run after idol worship. And so what we have to understand here, in our view today, it almost seems ludicrous idol worship, that people set up wooden or metal objects and worship them. But idol worship was very, very different from that. That was only the outer vestige of idol worship. Each of the types of idol worship had what's called an avoda, a service that went with it, a philosophy that went with it. The idols were just a representation of these ideas. And without getting into details, this kind of reality still exists in the world. That there are the vestiges of what might appear to be idol worship, and but the philosophy behind it, in most cases, is far from that. But still, just the fact that there are vestiges of it, that runs against everything that the Torah teaches. But here, we have to understand again that the idol worship went with a way of serving. And a lot of the ways of the serving these different gods were connected very much to pleasure, sometimes sexuality, to lust. And so people fell into these types of what are called idol worship. But it's important because, again, when we look backwards, it's like, how could people have fallen for this? So what Menashe was saying was something very, very important, that we understand that there was a tremendous drive behind these philosophies, and that they appealed to people's emotions, to the people's psyche, to people's, in many cases, bodily needs and desires, and they could fulfill through this different type of idol worship. So again, the idea of having wooden or metal idols, that is just a very superficial way to understand what was the draw for idol worship. So with this, the Gemara finishes what it has to say about Yeruvam. So now we're going to continue with Achav. And the Gemara asks, what does the name Achav mean? What does it mean? So Ach means brother, or Ach is an expression in the Torah that is like oi, like something terrible. Ach, something not good. And Av means father. So the sages say Ach means woe to heaven. And he, in other words, he caused woe to heaven. And he was a father of idolatry. And others say that the Ach was that he was like a brother to idol worship. And then it says about Achav, Vayihi hanakel lechto b'chatot Yeruvam ben Navat. So it says, again, all of this is in the second book of Kings. I'm not quoting every place that it comes from. So it says about Achav, his most trivial deed was following the sins of Yeruvam ben Navat. So in other words, Rabbi Yochanan says that the light sins of Achav, excuse me, excuse me, that the light sins of Achav were equal to the severest sins of Yeruvam. So the Gemara asks, because in the second book of Kings, all the kings after Yeruvam it says over and over again, they followed in the footsteps of Yeruvam. They followed in the evil that Yeruvam done. So the Gemara says that if the slightest thing that Achav did was equal to the worst thing that Yeruvam did, means that Achav was far worse than Yeruvam, far worse. So why does the text say over and over again that everyone was following Yeruvam? And it says very simply, because he was the first. He broke the mold of serving God, of following the Torah. And so all the subsequent sins of all of these kings could be traced back to Yeruvam. This is very similar to the idea of the sin of the golden calf, that the ramifications, the effects of that sin, everything goes in a certain way, can be traced back. So then they ask, how do we know that Achav does not have a place in the world to come? How do we know that? And so it says, V'hichreti la'achav mashtin b'kir v'atzuv v'azuv b'Yisrael. It says, God is speaking, I will cut off the house of Achav, and Achav will be withheld and abandoned in Israel. So they say from the word atzur, meaning withheld, that means that he is held back in this world and abandoned in the world to come. So then there's a verse that alludes to the idea. In other words, when the sages say in the Mishnah, these are the three kings who do not have a portion in the world to come, the usual question is, how do you know that? Where is your textual proof for it? So this verse that he will be withheld and he will be abandoned. So he will be withheld, meaning that his kingdom will come to an end. He was killed in battle, and he will be abandoned in the world to come. And so one second. And then it says, it brings up another king. Achav's son was Omri. Omri also, it says he did evil in God's eyes. And so the Gemara asks, well, why did he merit to become king? Like, what did he do? We know that Yeruvam, when he was chosen king, he was righteous. Omri was raised by Achav, and so he just learned his evil ways and he continued the evil ways. So the question is, so on what merit did he become king? And so it says, very interesting, it says, because he added one fortified city to Israel. So in the story of Omri, he purchased from the area called the Shomron. It was named after Shemer. He was the person who ruled over the Shomron. But Omri was able to purchase this and incorporate it into Israel. And so the Gemara says, because he was able to add to Eretz Yisrael, to this day, we talk about Samaria, the Shomron, and Yehuda. This is the heartland of Eretz Yisrael. And it was Omri that, at least in part, added this part of the Shomron to Israel. And it's interesting because he called the place after the person that he bought it from. In other words, he could have named it after himself, Omri. But he named it, which showed that he had at least a little bit of humbleness, a little bit of not complete power hungry that he named. From that, we get the title, the Shomron, to this day. And then the Gemara says, well, what about his father, Achav? What did he do to merit being king for 22 years? The text says that he was king for 22 years. So they ask, on what merit? So it says, because he honored the Torah that is given in 22 Hebrew letters. So because he honored the Torah, which is made up of the 22 Hebrew letters, he merited to rule for 22 years. So the Gemara says, where do we see that he honored the Torah? Again, if you look in the text, it's like he just did nothing but evil. Achab was like it says, compared to Yeruvam, he was the worst of the worst. He and Izebel, she brought the Baal. Before that, the worship of the Baal wasn't in Israel. But he married her, and she brought in the worship of the Baal, and Achab adopted it and helped spread it all over Israel. So where do you see that he honored the Torah? And so it tells a story that one of his enemies was Ben-Hadad. Ben-Hadad was from, I think, from Aram. And he sent a messenger to Achav saying, everything that you have belongs to me. In other words, in exchange for me not attacking you, there's all of your wealth, and it says even your wives and your children, they're all mine, and I can come and take whatever I want, and you will do homage to me. And Achav sent back and said, I agree. Just like, don't attack me, and come and take whatever you want. And then Ben-Hadad sent another message saying, I'm sending messengers, I'm coming, and I am going to take that which is most precious from you. And so Achav, it says, he turned to the elders and said, I don't think I can do that. And the elder said, you're right, you can't do it. So the question is, what was so precious to Achav? And so the answer that the Sefer Torah. In other words, Ben-Hadad wanted to prove not only that he ruled over Achav's wealth, but also he was going to, in a certain way, not to destroy or not show any honor to the Torah. And Achav sent back saying, that I can't do. And so the Gemara says, well, maybe this precious thing was one of his idols. And they said, well, no, because he consulted with the elders. And the elders, it's understood that they were holy people, because we know not everyone worshipped idols. The vast majority of the people did. But it's clear in the text that there would always be a remnant that would be true to the Torah. And so we see that by him not allowing Ben-Hadad to come and take the Torah shows that on that merit, he merited to rule for 22 years. Okay, now here again, this is another statement. Rav Nachman says, Achav shakul haya. Achav was equally balanced between good actions and evil actions. Again, you don't see that in the text. It only talks about his evilness. And yet, there's already a hint to it because at different times, Eliyahu Navi showed honor to Achav. And it's not explained why he showed honor to him. Other times, Eliyahu was really down on Achav's case. But throughout the whole story of Eliyahu, Achav is the king. So Rav Nachman says, actually, Achav was evenly balanced between his good and his evil. And so they ask, wait one second. Oh, so the answer, they say, Rav Nachman, how could you say such a thing? Like the text says he was such an evil king, and his wife was even worse. And so Rav Yosef explains that Achav was very liberal with his money, and Torah scholars benefited from his wealth. Therefore, half of his sins were forgiven. So the question is, well, where do we see that? Well, we know from history that one of the reasons that Achav was able to stay in power for 22 years, because during that period, apparently he, we'll call it in a secular way, let's forget religion here altogether for 1 second, that he was a very powerful king. And the northern kingdom was very wealthy, well established. And so, unfortunately, we know from history, in many, many places, many empires, there could be a lot of evil going on. But if people are wealthy, well-to-do, everyone is happy, no one's lacking anything, well, why rock the boat? And so apparently Achav was very liberal with his money. But they say, well, where do you see that he honored Torah scholars? So the answer 2 ways. One is that because he was liberal with his money for his whole population, so Torah scholars benefited also. And the other is a story when Melech Yehoshaphat from the southern kingdom came to Achav and they discussed different things. So it says, and Yehoshaphat was a very, very righteous king, and he brought a whole entourage with him. And it says that Achav made a great feast for them and he showed them honor. So the answer, that is how he benefited Torah scholars. But again, this just brings up our question again. And so the Art Scroll even says the Gemara does not cite a scriptural basis for the statement that Achav was liberal with his money. But this holds for many things we've been learning tonight, that in a certain way there is no scriptural basis for many of the things that the sages were saying. So here we understand that this is the essence of the oral Torah. And so therefore, they're giving over what they learned and what from the ones that they learned from their teachers, going back that the stories of these 3 kings are not as simple as the text seems to make it out. Because if not, we would say this all sounds very, in a certain way, outrageous. But here we remember we have the whole story of the four who entered the Pardes. Acher, who became a heretic and did some very, very not good things afterwards, but at one point he was a great Torah scholar. So apparently they had a tradition. And in a certain way, this makes the kings even worse than had they not been Torah scholars. So like here, like Omri, on what basis, on what merit did he become king? Doesn't say he was a Torah scholar. He did some act that was good. And he was raised in the house of evil. So they don't say that about Omri. But these three apparently, and we know from Yeruvam, God would not have chosen Yeruvam to be the king of the northern kingdom at that point if he wasn't righteous. Okay, we're almost done with Achav, and next week we'll learn about Menashe. We'll go a little bit longer so we can finish about Achav. So then, in the text, it says that God, one second. God had already stated that Yeruvam's time was about to finish because he had done so much evil. And so there's this whole idea that God was saying, how are we going to, in a certain way, entice Achav into battle and he'll be killed there? In other words, God was looking for a way to end Achav's kingship. And so it says in the text, V'yetze haruach v'yamod lifnei Hashem v'yomer ani eftanu v'yomar Hashem elav b'ma v'yomar yitzei v'yiti ruach sheker b'fi kol nevi'av. So a spirit comes before God and says, I will entice him. And God says, how will you entice him? And the spirit says, I will put false words in the speech of his prophets, who will tell him, yes, go to war and you will be victorious. That's how we'll entice him, and then he'll be killed in battle. And so it says, well, who is this spirit? So if you remember, this spirit, if you remember the whole story, that Achav wanted land from Naboth, Israelite, and he had a vineyard. And Achav wanted this vineyard. It was right next to his land. And Naboth did not want to sell it. It was from his inheritance. And so Achav tells Isabel, and she plots, and she tells a story that he was plotting against the king, and he was killed. And so this is the spirit that comes before God and said, I will entice him. How will he entice him? That will put like false words in the words of his prophets and entice him to war. And that's what happened. But here it says that God sent away the spirit, not that he couldn't do what he said, but no falsity can be before God. And he quotes a verse And what's interesting here, this is the same verse that when Rebbe Akiva, they're going into the Pardes, and he says, don't say water, water, because, and then he quotes this verse, which is, Devar shkarim lo yikon leneged einai, because God says words of falseness will not stand before my eyes. So that Rebbe Akiva said to them, don't be fooled. Don't be tricked by the image that you'll see of water, water, of the dichotomy, of the paradox that you will face in this spiritual ascent. Because if you say water, water, it's not true. And if it's not true, you can't stand before God. This is the exact verse that God said to this Ruach, meaning go ahead and entice Achav because his rule has to end. But false statements can't stand before me. And the last thing it says about Achav, it says that Achav set up this idol worship called the Asherah. And it says that Achav did more to anger Hashem than all the kings that preceded him. So Rabbi Yochanan says, well, what specific thing did he did that was worse than anything else? And so there was a tradition that he had written on the doors of the Shomron. It says, Achav kafar be'elokai Yisrael, that Achav denied the God of Israel, and he had written on the doors of Shomron that Achav has denied the God of Israel. That was the word that went out among the people. And they wrote it on their doors. Achav has denied the God of Israel, as if that gives them permission to deny the God of Israel. And so the portion of the Gemara that ends about Achav is therefore he has no portion in the world to come. That he went so far as publicly denying the God of Israel, that's like over the line. And that's just another reason why he has no portion in the world to come. So today we have finished with Yeruvam and Achav, according to what the sages teach us. And next week will be the final class in our journey through the books of the prophets, and we'll be learning about Menashe. And I will mention this once again, that our learning tonight was in the merit of Moshe ben David, the husband of Wendy, who we will hear from in just a few minutes.